The United States just signed a trade deal with the European Union. It looks like the last nail in the coffin to entirely destroy the European economy. European economies have already been suffering for the last 15 years, and this deal is going to put the last nail in the coffin and will put an end to the European Union. So let me explain what this deal is all about and how it will impact both economies, the US economy and the European economy. So if you're ready, give this video a thumbs up and let's dive right into it. The deal starts with the fact that there will be a 15% tariff on all EU goods that enter the United States, while there will be zero tariffs on all US goods. And by looking at it from the first perspective, it looks like a great deal for the United States. I still can't believe that they secured such a deal. Secondly, the EU will buy $750 billion worth of energy from the United States. And this is probably the biggest problem for the European Union, and I'll explain that a bit later. Thirdly, a $600 billion investment will be followed up to the United States by the European Union. And finally, the EU will buy hundreds of billions of dollars of military equipment. On paper, it looks like a great deal for the United States, an absolute disaster for the European Union. The only good news for the European Union is that this is legally non-binding preliminary agreement. And that means that we basically agreed on certain stuffs on the framework on how we are going to negotiate from now onwards, but it does not actually require any sides to commit to anything. It means that now European Union will go back to the European Union, which consists of a lot of countries, and all of these countries together will discuss whether they are going to accept these terms or not. And the European Union is a huge bloc that consists of Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Greece, Finland, Scotland, and other countries, which means that Scotland is part of the UK anyways, but you get the point, right? To understand whether it's a good deal or a bad deal, let's compare the deal that was there before Trump and the deal that we have right now. The deal that was prior that all the costs that will enter the United States, including from the European Union, will be tariffed at 2.5%. But if it's a pickup truck, it's a 25% tariff. Because the United States is really great at producing pickup trucks. There isn't many countries around the world, especially in the European Union, that drive a lot of pickup trucks. If you literally just pick a flight and go to Italy, you will find out why nobody in Italy buys a pickup truck. It simply does not make sense. Those little Italian roads are not made for the pickup trucks. Take a flight to Spain, you will find the exact same thing. Go to France, you will see the exact same thing. Yes, maybe if you're actually traveling between the cities, you have all these huge highways, it makes sense in those circumstances. But if you're driving in the streets of Amsterdam, you need a bicycle, not a pickup truck. The EU used to charge a 10% tariff on all the US cars that will enter the European Union. In fact, on all the cars that will enter the European Union. At first glance, it does not seem like a good deal for the United States. However, if you think about it, it was a great deal for both parties. Because the United States is not really as competitive as the European car companies when it comes to producing the light cars such as sedans. But European Union on the other side is not literally does not have the opportunity to compete with Ford and American manufacturers when it comes to pickup trucks. So they kind of balanced one another, because you want to drive a BMW, you want to buy a Mercedes, and you will only pay a 2.5% tariff, which make these cars very affordable in the United States. However, all the cars from now onwards that will enter the United States from the European Union will be charged a 15% tariff. And that means that if you ever want to buy a BMW or a Mercedes or a Volkswagen or any car that is made in the European Union, it's going to become slightly more expensive, which means that American car manufacturers do not have to innovate from now onwards. They don't have to try to compete with German cars, because the government just made artificially those cars much more expensive, which means that you're going to go to the store right now and a BMW is going to cost a lot more than Ford. And most people looking at these two prices will say, maybe I will settle for a Ford, even though that BMW is a far more superior car. On the other side, American cars can now be sold in the European Union at 0% tariff. Prior to that, it was 10% tariff. By looking at this alone, it might seem like America will be selling far more cars in the European Union. But that's not going to happen for two reasons. First of all, In European Union, you pay value-added tax of around 20%. It literally depends on the country, but it's around between 18 to 25%, which means that you will pay a 20% VAT tax on both a Ford and BMW. But BMW will get a tax break from the government, which means that BMW can slightly lower down their prices by 10% at least to compete much stronger with Ford. Secondly, European Union is moving to EVs. Over the last 20 years, European governments have been providing subsidies to encourage people to drive EVs. And that means that if you buy an EV, it is going to be much cheaper than a traditional car because the government is providing subsidies. Now, the United States has recently passed the Big Beautiful Bill, which stripped off the subsidies to all the EV car companies and clean energy, which means that now it is going to be much more expensive to produce EVs in the United States, which means that their prices are going to rise, which means that if you even ship them to the European Union, they are going to be far more expensive, which means that they don't have an edge. European Union will continue to electrify its entire industries. And that also could possibly mean that in order to compensate for that, European Union could lower down the tariffs on Chinese EVs. And there is no way a single car company in the United States can compete with Chinese electrical cars, which means that the sales of American cars in the European Union is unlikely to increase even though that you have like 0% tariffs. In the best case scenario, these tariffs might generate to the United States government $90 billion, assuming that trade is going to stay the same. But since it's much more difficult to sell in the United States now, it's far more expensive. Sales of the European products in the United States is going to plummet, which means that this number is going to decrease over time. And the European Union also made it clear that we are going to diversify to other countries. We are going to sell in other countries because the United States is no longer a reliable partner. We thought that we're friends. We thought that we are giving you something and we want to get something in return, but it seems like you want everything. The biggest problem with this deal is that European Union promised to buy $750 billion worth of energy over the next 3 years. And that's $250 billion every single year until Trump is president. And that is probably the biggest challenge that I see with this deal. Look at this graph. This is the prices of energy in the European Union. And in 2022, something fundamentally happens and energy prices rise. Because up until 2022, European Union was mainly buying its energy from Russia because it's much cheaper to get them. You literally just build a pipeline from Siberia to Germany, and now you have freaking super cheap energy that flows from the Siberia into the European Union. But starting from 2022, when the United States imposed sanctions on Russia, and it also pushed the European Union to stop buying the Russian gas, European economies began to suffer. GDP started falling down, energy prices began to rise, and a lot of factories start to shut down because it does not make economically to run these factories when you have to pay astronomically high energy prices. Secondly, one of the main replacements for Russian energy was American energy. But American energy is always much more expensive since you have to load them on huge expensive ships and get them through the entire Atlantic and bring them to the United States. Whereas on the other side, you literally just have a pipeline that takes that energy and brings it from the hearts of Siberia into the heart of Berlin, which is why energy prices began to increase dramatically. But of course, Europe cannot possibly buy all of its energy from the United States. Otherwise, the European Union will be in a financial catastrophe. I mean, they have already been suffering financially for the last 15 years, but with this act, it is going to worsen the entire situation. You see, European Union imports around $430 billion worth of energy annually. And with this deal, that means that 60% of all the energy will be coming from the United States. So before 2022, they've been heavily relying on Russia. With this deal, they will totally start to rely on the United States. But the problem is that if you look at the European countries, you will see that major European economies, such as Germany, already buy 92% of its entire energy from the United States. So I don't know who exactly is going to buy all of that energy. Spain? I mean, Spain is literally suffering financially for the last 20 years. I guess they haven't got out of the 2008 financial crisis. And Spain has a lot of problems. I mean, if you ever travel to Spain, all you see that there is a youth unemployment of 30% probably. Italy is also not in a position to buy all of that LNG from the United States. France is energy independent, so I don't actually know which European economies are going to buy most of that energy, given the fact that right now they import around $80 to $90 billion worth of energy from the United States. With this act, they have to not just triple their energy imports from the United States, but much more than that, which will jeopardize European economies. If you look at the GDP of the European Union, you will see that back in 2008, they were very close with the United States. In fact, the average European was much wealthier than the average American. But since then, their economies have been suffering while the US economy has been growing tremendously. And this is the time for the European Union to invest in itself, bring down energy prices, invest in technologies, invest in other industries. But with this deal, it means that all the extra money that Europe will make will only spend it on extra energy from the United States, which means that they're probably going to continue stagnating for the next 5 to 10 years at least. The next part of this deal is that European Union will invest $600 billion into the United States. And this is probably the most interesting part. If you look at the European Union, over the last 15 to 20 years, they have been heavily investing in the United States. And that's part of the reason why the US economy have been growing while the European economy has been stagnating. Just look at the numbers. There are two types of investments that you can possibly make. The one is debt. And the European economies hold around $1.6 trillion of US debt. And that's a lot of debt. It's literally a lot of debt. Imagine they gave the US government $1.6 trillion for the US government to invest that money in the United States. That money could have been invested in the European Union. That money could have been invested by building better trains, better roads, better infrastructure, attract talent. But instead, they invested that money into the United States. But this is far from over. If you look at the stock market, European Union holds around $9 trillion of US stocks. And that is literally 50% of all foreign holders of the US stocks. So if you look at the US stock market, which is the largest market in the world, and you see that there is a percentage of stocks around 18 to 19 trillion dollars being held by foreign investors. And half of that is the European Union. So they've been pretty much investing in the US stock market over the last 20 years. And that probably explains why the US stock market has been growing tremendously over the last 15 years, but the European stocks have been plummeting and haven't been growing much because all of that money being invested in the United States. So I don't see why do you want an extra $600 billion worth of investments. I mean, even if you did not do this deal, they would probably continue investing in the United States. As long as it was profitable to trade with the United States, it makes sense to continue investing in the United States. So I don't know if anybody will be encouraged from now onwards to keep investing in the US when you have such a bad deal. There is also a deal that they will be buying hundreds of billions of dollars of military technology from the United States. NATO countries mostly rely on the United States and the US military-industrial complex to buy their military technologies and military equipments. There is nothing absolutely new. For example, F-16s or F-15s. They're mainly produced by the United States and every other NATO country needs them, so they have to buy them anyways. So whether that deal was signed with Trump or without Trump or before Trump or after Trump, that deal was already there in place. They already spent hundreds of billions of dollars buying HIMARS, buying F-15s, buying F-16s, and buying whatever military technology the United States produces because they are part of NATO bloc, and NATO countries need to have one joint military infrastructure for them to function efficiently between one another. What I want to remind you is that this deal isn't signed yet, so we don't know for a fact how the final deal is going to look like. But if they sign this deal, energy prices in the European Union are going to rise dramatically, which will put out of business a lot of factories. A lot of factories in Germany have already been closing down, and more factories will be closing down pushing the European Union into another recession. Will Spain, Greece, and Italy buy more of US energy that is extremely expensive compared to other sources that they have? For example, from Middle East? Well, I don't think so. If Germany is already buying so much US energy, why would they buy more even if they cannot possibly afford it? There's so many questions about this deal that it doesn't possibly make sense, but we'll have to wait and see. But if this $600 billion investment is going to happen, it is most likely going to go into the equity market because the US debt in a huge crisis. And that means good news for the US stock market. And if you want to know how I invest in the stock market and what is my strategy to profit out of it, then you know exactly what to do. There is a link in the description of this video. Check it out and you'll find out more. That's it for today. Thanks guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.